Alrighty, so last session of the conference. Everything's game. Follow-up or maybe new comments? Anybody have something they'd like to contribute or ask? Don't embarrass me now, come on. All right, there you go.
I don't actually have a question, just a comment. I've spoken to many of you individually, but just wanted to take the opportunity to thank all of you for doing what you do in your work and then taking the time to come here and share everything that you've learned, everything you're trying to learn, and clearing up a lot of myths that are out there. And I find it's very humbling and inspiring, personally, to be able to sit here and listen to all of you. So thank you very much.
I think there's a significant body of evidence that alcohol and nicotine are change things at more or less first exposure, and with some degree of permanence in the incompletely developed brain. So, and the younger the person is, the worse that is. That they, people should not have those things until their brains are 18, or preferably, even into their 20s. And the frontal lobes don't finish developing until 24 or 25. In various cultures, in terms of the entheogens, I know that people go through coming-of-age rituals, sometimes in their early and mid-teens, and it seems to me that there's a significant difference between Western substances and synthetic substances and entheogens, and that there are good drugs and bad drugs. And so, in terms of the entheogens, I'm just wondering if you, any of you would like to comment on, on what ages you think would be, appropriate. Obviously, it depends on the person as well. But anything you'd like to say about ages at which children, younger people, might start being exposed to these things beneficially? Thanks.
Obviously, it's a sort of an explosive question. I mean, I think if I were to, state from my own sort of view, I think older is better. Wait till you're 50, But the fact is that I've known a lot of people who started out their psychedelic careers or cannabis smoking careers at age 12 and 13 and stuff, and feel pretty good about how that went. And then there are other people who are not so happy about how all that has gone. And so I mean, as far as my own view of sort of the traditional cultures and the way that people are exposed to things, I think the reality is that young people have access to information and stuff at a way earlier age. I mean, and there's a huge differentiation within the population of when people are exposed to things. I mean, I remember when I was going through high school in the late 80s, I was told that, the average age of first sexual intercourse was 13 or something like that. And I remember hearing from my younger, not quite brother, that he had his first, I'll stop there, that many people around me were having lots of deep, weird adult experiences that I wasn't having, and I didn't particularly want to have them. And so, I mean, as far as on an individual basis, I have no idea, and on a cultural basis, I think that we're just in a soup where it's not clear to me that there is one answer or one positive model that's going to work.
The only thing I would add to that is that, that's a topic that comes up a lot, and every time that we say, it seems like waiting past 15 or 16 or 17, which is an age that a lot of people first have a psychedelic experience, somebody stands up and says, I had my first experience at 16, and if I hadn't, I would have committed suicide. I would have, it was the only thing keeping me sane. It was the thing that changed my life for the better at a very early age. And so it's difficult to say that people should wait until they're 20 when so many people express that their younger experiences were very good for them. So it's difficult to really put a number on that.
I don't personally have much to add to that, but would like to pass along something attributed to Ram Dass, who said, presumably of higher dose experiences, it is better to become somebody before you become nobody.
I'd add something to that, if I might, that regardless of age, that information of, it's kind of controversial, but how to do drugs, how to take drugs, and why not to take certain drugs. If given that information with proper guidance, people make better decisions. And so, hats off to the Erowid folks for providing that information. Other comments or thoughts? Miss?
I guess actually you just kind of said what I was going to say. I don't think that there's any good drugs or bad drugs, just good uses and bad uses of a substance. It's just a physical thing. However, Sir Bob, on the end, I was wondering if your organization has at all looked at the structure of like medical marijuana use and whether or not there needs to be a pharmaceutical company funding your program, or if you could get scripts given to people who are already cultivating mushrooms and creating LSD as a way, like the marijuana growers in California, and now New Jersey's looking at it, and Colorado, to distribute the medicine direct to the people from people who actually know best what to do, since they've been doing it for years.
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but most of the people that are treating their headaches grow them themselves now, just so that they know what they are getting. As far as funding and how it's all going to end up being organized, it's very difficult getting people to accept what they, when they try to explain even to their family, in a lot of cases, it's not very well accepted. I know that a lot of people have tried marijuana for their cluster headaches, and it does not help at all. I mean, and it's more of a trigger probably than a help. But as far as trying to find the funding for it, that's going to be the key and how it's applied.
The question. Sorry. I guess it was less a question and more perhaps a suggestion of a way to look at a different way to solve the problem of getting medicine into people's hands. If you can't get millions of dollars needed for like a pharmaceutical thing, perhaps there's another way to go about it. And I was just wondering if you had looked at the structure of the way they do hand out medicinal marijuana. Not that that's the answer for you, but to get scripts for medicinal mushrooms.
No. Well, it is a very good idea. It's not something that we've gotten to at this point. Right now, our distribution system is pretty much underground. When people, find out that somebody else needs something to try, I mean, it still happens the same way it happened for me. They just magically appear on their doorstep. But yeah, that's certainly a way that we're going to need to be going. Is to probably follow that same model.
Other comments about grassroots distribution or something like that?
The only thought I have about that is that the numbers are so much smaller in terms of people who need the service of a medicinal mushroom service, that it might be a lot harder to do than a medical marijuana model.
There's a comment over here.
I had a question for Bob. Regarding the BOL 148, I hadn't heard that yet, and I'm just curious as to what sort of work is being done with that. I know it has much higher affinity for the receptor than LSD even does, but with virtually no CNS effects, and I'm wondering, that seems to be heading in the right direction as to what the cause and root of these headaches are and how these indole alkaloids are helping them. And second part of that question is if BOL is indeed patentable, then you don't have the cultural stigma of a centrally active psychedelic, and you have an incentive for a company to put some money into researching it.
Well, I can't say BOL is patentable, and McLean Hospital does now hold the patent on BOL. Following this recent work that we've been doing with BOL, but with clusters in Germany. And the way we ended up going to BOL was, it was either going to be helpful for cluster headaches, or it was going to prove to us that the hallucinogenic properties of psilocybin and LSD are actually necessary for treating the cluster headaches. So when we did that research, it was sort of a win-win situation for us. It was either going to back up our work with psilocybin and the psychedelic portions of that, or if we were going to find something that was a non-hallucinogen that was going to be able to treat cluster headaches. And I think that that's what we've found. But my concern with the BOL is that I don't believe that it treats all the damage that's been done to these people for 20 or 30 years anywhere near as much as psilocybin or LSD has. I mean, the people that try this treatment, even if it doesn't give them 100% relief, I would say 90% of the people that try it never go back to conventional medicine again to treat their cluster headaches. And that's after years of spending, you know, $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 a year on prescription drugs. So all we're doing is trying to follow every possible lead, and where this is going to take us, I don't know, but we just need to keep knocking on every door that we can. So,
you know, I want to give the panelists permission to speak on any topic that you want. It doesn't have to be a question directly to you. It can be a comment on that question or something you would like to say that didn't get said on a totally unrelated topic. So feel free to do that as well. Any takers? Okay, well, other questions? Sir.
So I've been trying to phrase this as a question in my mind, but it might be a bit more of a statement that I was hoping some of you might riff on. But I was thinking about the psychedelic boom of the 60s and 70s, and I was thinking about Valerie's presentation about bad trips and how you want to not talk someone down from a bad trip, but talk them through it. And it seems to me that a lot of people who have psychedelic experiences look at the society around them and feel that the values that that society espouses and is predicated upon have all the hallmarks of a bad trip, and how things like the pranksters and the League of Spiritual Discovery, the reason they were so badly received is that they were talking down to society. And I really respect that a lot of the speakers here at this conference are working within existing frameworks and within the system. And so I just wanted to see if any of you wanted to riff on just the idea of counterculture as opposed to the idea of like what it seems to me we've seen here this weekend, which is people working within the system, and the idea that the psychedelic community isn't a community aside from society, but that it's just one part of a series of concentric circles.
One of the slides that we dropped to cut time was a Venn diagram of communities, sort of a series of zooms of different communities where, like you said, sort of not exactly concentric circles, but sort of overlapping circles of communities. I definitely see, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can slice the world and create boundaries and come up with definitions that separate people, and there are other ways that you can come up with definitions that connect people. And I definitely think that there are ways in which the subcultures are distinct, and other ways in which, you know, I go to some government meeting and it's, you know, the people who are in that room don't, there aren't hard lines, you know, and the people, you know, someone who had a very positive experience on LSD and someone who had a very negative experience on LSD can be working in the same room, and they don't necessarily have to be completely at odds.
About I guess it's about 10 years ago now, no, a little less, I did one of the most countercultural things I've ever done. I cut off my hair and I took off the rainbow clothes. And the reaction I got from the counterculture was that I'd sold out. Someone accused me of looking like a policeman, etc., etc. And I felt the same on the inside, but I'd taken off the uniform. And it made me question, what is the counterculture? Maybe if you grow your own food and produce your own electricity and harvest your own water, etc., you're genuinely outside society, but we eat, we depend on capitalism. In some ways, the psychedelic scene is a product of modernity and capitalism. You know, we've been talking about these drugs that are being marketed and distributed through, you know, they're grown in one place and distributed by air and rail and sea and so on and so forth. So I would question this dialectical opposition that's placed between the mainstream and the counterculture.
Other thoughts? Other questions? You know, I wanted to follow up on the glaring absence of that prior question that the woman asked, because I think she's left for the day. But I wanted to add that one event that we haven't publicized is the Women's Visionary Congress, which is coming up next week. visionarycongress.org, I believe, Annie Harrison's group. And so I encourage you with interest to explore that as a possible opportunity that's coming right around the corner. I don't know, you have to ask Annie. Men are allowed, yes. I know that to be the case. And I've invited the woman who spoke to help us curate the conference next year to channel her passion. Hold on for a second.
Okay, I guess what I would like to ask you is, just probably about a month ago, you wouldn't have found me here, because I am very anti-drug, to tell you the truth, in so many ways, and so I don't really look at drugs as being, all drugs being good. There's methamphetamines, there's a lot of drugs that I see people as a therapist dealing with and struggling with that are not very positive. And I think what brought me here was this experience with a plant that was very positive and very spiritually awakening. So I came here in that context. And I guess and I see here, I sort of am viewing almost three different camps of one being spiritual, one being medical, and the other one being sort of the freedom of choice. And I'm not sure exactly how I feel about all the different parts of it, because going into the medical field and that control from the medical field I'm not so happy with. You know, just the freedom of the choice and watching out for our kids and the way that these drugs can be used is a big concern of mine. And, you know, and spiritually, it's, I think, something very powerful, but it still needs to be held in a context. And how can we do that in a free society without all the other stuff? So I'd just like you to comment on that.
It's unfortunately very difficult to hear all of the question as it happens, so try to follow along as they go. But there are certainly a lot of problems in the world caused by people's recreational or self-medication use of psychoactive drugs. And one of the things that's very obvious to us from our work is that right now they're generally all illegal, and those problems all exist within a model where they are completely illegal and supposedly not accessible to people. So clearly something needs to change about that model. Now, I don't think that we wouldn't certainly argue for full legalization of all psychoactive drugs in some fast move, because I don't think that the culture can handle that. I don't think people know how to deal with that. But it's not clear what the correct model should be. You know, but something different than it is now. But hopefully we don't try to. I hope that nothing we've said comes across as trying to downplay the very negative things that do happen also. So I don't know.
You know, I'd like to add that ritual in the tribal setting people talk about, and they don't talk about ritual in the modern setting, but methodology, both for research and for treatment and for spiritual use, it evolved over millennia in the tribal settings. We've been replicating that here in the West. And ritual is not something that's, kind of religious mumbo jumbo, but it's simply an instantiation of safety and efficacy guidelines. It's curbs against inappropriate use. And so we're sort of reinventing the wheel a little bit in the West, but those rituals that we have, the modern rituals, help us achieve safety and achieve efficacy in a safe way.
One of the primary things that I feel like I've learned through our work is that there are, the world of psychoactive drugs and technologies and practices is so broad that the way that we define it is includes caffeine and all of the other sort of even more and more subtle herbs and things. And I think there's sort of the good drugs, bad drugs debate, and there's the whether or not it's appropriate to include caffeine under sort of psychoactive drugs. I mean, we had a debate on reason. I have a good on a forum last year, a public forum about that issue, and some people who work in drug abuse, Cato, sorry, work in drug abuse don't want to include some of the sort of more subtle things in the world of sort of psychoactive drugs because it complicates the discussion about how people abuse and what mistakes people make and the worst problems that occur. And the way that I see the world and the way that I sort of break down what I read about other people doing and see other people doing makes it so that it's very obvious to me that this culture, this world, this society has a really long way to go in terms of developing sane, responsible understandings of how to manage living in a world where literally everyone has access to strong psychoactive drugs, and a lot of people are encouraged to use them starting at a very young age. I mean, not to bring up something that is just really cliche, but a lot of kids are prescribed psychoactive drugs to keep them in their seats in school and help them focus. And from that age, I mean, from very young now, we are exposed to these things and have to make choices about them. And it's not clear to me that we have really successful models that will continue. And I think that it's an open question to me how we move forward in that and how we train people to, it's a pharmacy out there. I mean, one of the things that just strikes me personally every time I turn on the television and watch, I actually really like American football, not because of anything we do. It's horrible. It's a horrible little spectacle. But if one watches it, one is exposed. I am exposed to pharmaceutical ads almost at every turn. I mean, Viagra ads, and it looks pretty cool. I don't know if you guys have heard about this thing. The pharmaceutical companies are pushing recreational drugs in prime time, and I mean, I don't know, maybe I do need some help. Maybe I need a lot of help. I don't know how other people make good choices around those things. So, good luck.
One thing I neglected to say in my talk is that there is one drug which we can point to that has a clear, unbroken history stretching back to the Neolithic, and that drug is opium. It turns up in Neolithic graves in Spain, and that's a very uncomfortable piece of information because in our current society, opium or the opiates are seen as very problematic. However, context is everything. If you have to have major operative surgery, you will be prescribed diamorphine, and it's a very benign analgesic. And we've been talking about palliative care for cancer patients, and morphine is a wonderful thing. And people who come out of hospital, having been prescribed morphine, tend not to become addicts. And yet that same drug on the streets is called heroin, and has a very different context. So context is everything.
And the cultural differences. one of my sons married a woman from Iran and had a wedding in Tehran. And in that world, alcohol is totally taboo. And if you want alcohol at the wedding reception, you have to buy it on the black market. You have to cover up the windows at the reception. You might have to pay off a policeman in order to have your alcohol. Here we serve it at the White House, okay? And it's just intriguing, the different, you know, in that part of the world, smoking opium is much less culturally upsetting than drinking alcohol, you know? It's a very irrational climate up there, as I see it.
In my clinical work, I haven't had to confront the issue directly of working with minors, but I think it is an important one to consider. For my doctoral research that I'm doing, I'm looking at MDMA as a supplement to treatment for autism spectrum disorders, and spent a fair portion of this summer as a science-minded woman looking at lots of empirical data on the studies they did from 1959 to 1974. And one theme that recurred was the fact that psychedelics and drugs, pharmaceuticals in general, sort of behave differently in children. And I feel, given that awareness, the only option we really have is to continue the work researching thoroughly in an adult population. And once we have a better understanding, at least in the clinical realm, of indications for various substances, sort of working backwards from there. We were approached, Dr. Grove and I met with a woman who is an advocate for sort of a grassroots autism organization, and she was very enthusiastic about working with substances such as LSD and psilocybin in young children with autism, operating under the assumption that there's kind of a window of opportunity when children are very young. And it brought up a lot of ethical considerations, and I suppose the best response I have for that portion of your question right now is, in my opinion, we're not quite there yet. So in my work, I'm choosing to look at adults at the high-functioning end of the spectrum with Asperger's who can communicate about their experience, who can participate in interviews and so on, and then look at, when we've amassed a body of evidence and data, then think about working with younger and younger participants.
Question over here?
Just a couple comments from my perspective here. I'm in a unique position where I'm trying to invite people into the psychedelic community. And it's not real easy, even when people have been going through what they've been going through, but they've watched television ads for the last 40 years about this is your mind on drugs. And I think the psychedelic community is very much misunderstood. And it's a huge problem on our end is that researchers and institutions are afraid to even touch them and put their names on them. Like I mentioned earlier, psilocybin and LSD were looked at as headache treatments, 40 or 50 years ago, and then they were completely buried because of being made illegal. They should not have stopped the research, obviously. Otherwise, by now, 40 years later, I think an awful lot of suffering would have ended. Instead of that, we're getting a lot of other prescription medications. I used to have more hair than Andy, and now, I've got nothing. I've got a hip that probably needs to be replaced because of the way my vascular system has been destroyed by the different ergots and other chemicals. And I've had 2 heart attacks in the last 2 years. I'm a mess based on trying to treat my headaches with something that probably should have been on the market 40 years ago, and it's still at a point where people are afraid to not only research it, but even talk about it. I mean, I'll mention it to someone, and if I mention it on the internet, invariably somebody posts right after that how can you tell these people to be taking these psychedelic drugs? I took some with my friends 40 years ago, and we took very low doses, and the other 4 are all still in a hospital. And I'm like, would you like to give me their names and the address of the hospital, because I'd like to go and introduce myself to these 4 people. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, and if people don't start talking about them, the truth isn't going to get out there. So I think that's very important to do.
One thing that comes to mind around, as you said, introducing people or inviting people into the psychedelic community, as I started to hint this morning or earlier this afternoon, that word carries a lot of connotations. If you just play a little word association game, psychedelic, what pops up? I tried this some years ago and did a LexisNexis search through major national publications. And the associations often that come up with it are lava lamps, bell bottoms, blacklight posters, rock music, anything bright, colorful, swirly, war protest, communes, you know, basically the zeitgeist of the 60s. I think it just will do well to remember that for many audiences, to say the word psychedelic, maybe to say the word LSD, is to evoke, even unconsciously, all of those associations. One of the minor reasons why some of the work taking place, I think I can speak for Hopkins, with psilocybin, is because the name of psilocybin is not LSD. In addition to having a shorter duration of action, it's just a less loaded word. Yeah, we're still living out some of the excesses, some of the understandable immaturities and exuberances of the 1960s.
Yeah, just to build on that, you know, psilocybin as a drug, the drug that we chose to work with, has many pluses for it. You know, the duration of action is only 6 hours, which works nice into the typical workday. It has a wonderful natural history stretching back a couple thousand years. You know, it's been used a bit, has a very good safety profile, physiologically certainly. It's been used in psychotherapy with reasonable anecdotal results. But one of the biggest pluses of psilocybin, I've come to feel, is that it's hard to spell. And you know, that there's LSD and that other drug, and it really makes it much easier to work with.
Another question over here.
So, to the best of my knowledge, the extensions of psychedelic culture through what we call the third world are more or less limited to ayahuasca religions in Brazil, perhaps the Bwiti religion in West Africa. And I was wondering if any of you had any input on the possibility of blossoming interest in psychedelics throughout developing nations as well as the developed world, because thus far it's more or less been a privilege of the Western and English-speaking nations to introduce the influence of substances, especially synthetic substances like LSD and MDMA, into the population. And I was interested to hear any conjectures that you might have on the future of psychedelics in the third world and perhaps also in rising nations such as China and India. So any input that you guys have on that would be great. Thanks.
I have opinion about everything. Very handy. Well, I mean, I think you're probably right, but I mean, I think they're playing techno in every country these days, aren't they? I mean, I know that it's certainly true that some of the more interesting synthetic drugs are definitely more expensive. There's you know, they've got psilocybin mushrooms in Southeast Asia and South America. And, you know, we definitely get reports of huge parties going on more or less everywhere, where some portion of the population, we get very little about Africa, I guess, but you know, South, we get, you know, China, we've gotten some reports. We don't really have any sort of Chinese-speaking reading people in our group, but you know, we have gotten reports of, you know, some pretty big underground, you know, MDMA rave-style scenes in China. But, you know, I think that also the laws are pretty strict, and they're, you know, one wants to avoid going to jail there.
I have another perspective I can offer. Regardless of whether or not you consider ketamine a psychedelic or not, it certainly, you know, induces an altered state of consciousness. And doing some research recently, I discovered that ketamine has been enjoying unprecedented popularity amongst working class youth in Hong Kong. And I took a deep dive and read everything I could get my hands on, and probably one of the most interesting little bits of information I gleaned from that was that whereas psychedelics have been available in periods of time when they were popular elsewhere, the population there opted not to avail themselves of it. And I started to think deeply about, why is that the case? Why are they so gung-ho about ketamine? And even though other hallucinogens, classic hallucinogens, are available to them, they've opted not to use them. And, you know, I was working on a paper for a class and had to come up with some theory about it. But in doing a cross-cultural analysis, it could be argued, and there's evidence to back this up, that youth in a culture that is experiencing increasingly reduced freedoms, and yet they are in such a restrictive web of a collectivist culture that the notion of what they call sitting down to float may be very appealing and may be a means of moving towards a more whole human experience rather than always being caught up in this web of social obligations. Getting a little me time when you can sort of float above that. And I thought, well, do we see the reverse in the West? And citing a study that Charles Tart did in 1991 with his Buddhist Sangha of Tibetan Buddhists gathered, and he did a survey, and their responses indicate that they were sort of doing the same thing in reverse. They were a bunch of Westerners, you know, mostly white, mostly affluent, well-educated Bay Area types, and they were using the classic hallucinogens to experience non-duality and states of consciousness that we think of as Eastern. So I think we have to be careful about making any assumptions about multicultural use, because individuals in different cultures may be trying to achieve different ends by altering consciousness. So just one perspective I'll put out there.
It might be nice to try to help reintroduce traditional substances that are no longer used in the traditional cultures. Like India has the ancient memory of soma that's been abandoned as things have become more westernized everywhere. It'd be interesting to think of maybe not Western chemicals, but reintroducing traditional substances that are endemic to that culture that they've somehow begun to abandon. Sorry to hijack the. I have this mic. Did you want to have a comment?
I first wanted something to add to the ketamine case. Some of you may know that, but ketamine is a registered medication in many countries, and it can even be used here in the States. And since 3 years, there are going studies on demonstrating that ketamine enhances mood in refractory depression. So that's one way to go through the registration of a compound. And even in the US, who is very restricted with these compounds, this is a way that psychedelics can be used, at least in a medical way. Another thing is There is a conference every year by the American Association of Psychiatrists, about 30 to 40,000 meet once a year, and we have organized a workshop there for May next year to teach the psychiatrists how to use these drugs. So that's another avenue to reach mainstream science through science.
Other comments? Questions? Ooh, a lot.
So, Alicia, I'm curious to know about what you're doing with Asperger's syndrome and psychedelic treatment. I don't think you really discussed it yesterday when you were talking, but what are you really trying to accomplish, and really what kind of symptoms do you think you're going to be treating? Like, what aspect of this syndrome do you think is really going to be affected by psychedelic therapy?
Right. Well, the deeper I get into it, I have to be careful to sort of curtail my ambitions because it's a fascinating area of inquiry. I'm following my natural curiosity, and it started with these studies of, my God, they were giving children younger than 5 years old high doses of acid repeatedly, and these were children who could not speak, who had severe autism. At that time, it was still perceived as closely related to or a form of schizophrenia. They didn't really have an understanding of autism as a spectrum then, and I thought, as poorly designed as most of the studies were, and as unmethodologically sound as they were, pretty much across the board, the outcomes were generally neutral to positive, regardless of the demographics of the participants or the method or the dose. And I thought, there's something here that even if it's just a report that they noticed increased giggling and laughing and smiling and increased eye-to-face contact, I thought this merits another look. And Asperger's didn't appear in the English language literature until 1981. And so there's this whole other way to approach the spectrum from the other end. There's a generation of adults who were born before 1980 that didn't get diagnosed. And even today, a lot of people with Asperger's don't get diagnosed until they're past, the best window of opportunity for behavioral interventions. And I started looking and realized there's so many parallels between research with autism and people who've done very similar research with MDMA. One example I'll offer you is increased facial expression recognition. There have been studies, autism studies on that topic and MDMA studies, and there are quite a few of these, but there's a gap in the middle. Obviously, they've not done any clinical work that I've become aware of. And there have been some very recent studies published about a possible mechanism that might explain why MDMA may be an effective supplement to treating the cognitive empathy deficits that people with Asperger's or high-functioning autism experience. What I'm interested in doing right now, I'm very comfortable with baby steps. I want to talk to people in the Silicon Valley where it's rumored to be widely used, people self-medicating. I want to find out about their experiences and how long the effects are sustained. Do they feel compelled to scramble on the black market to try to keep having this opening, or do one or two experiences, as is often the case with neurotypicals, is that enough to promote a beneficial change? So I just want to start the dialogue. I don't, I'm trying to be realistic about, what one dissertation can accomplish. I just want to take a look at the literature, talk to some people who have, been experimenting with it, and start a dialogue. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Other questions? Lots of good questions.
Philosophically speaking, what do you think the relationship is between psychedelics and consciousness? Are you all dualists, materialists, something else?
That's a wonderful, huge question, and what is consciousness? No one really knows. We got all kinds of wonderful theories. Is it the ghost in the machine? Is it a deeper level of looking at the energy that makes up matter? We really don't know what matter is. In my own mind, I think of the brain as, you can look at it at a gross physiological level, you can look at it at a chemical level, you can look at it at a quantum physics level. These are all different languages for talking about the same thing. And when you get into physics, you really get into the mystery of energy. And physics and mysticism have an awful lot in common. And there's an incredible mystery there about just what we are or what matter is. Some of you may know the work of Teilhard de Chardin, who was he discovered Peking man and was also a mystic, but wrote a number of books, some from the viewpoint of a mystic and some from the viewpoint of a scientist, The Phenomenon of Man and The Hymn of the Universe and so on. But in The Hymn of the Universe, he has a section on the spiritual power of matter. And he essentially is saying if you go deep enough into the mystery of matter, you come to the spiritual. And there's the ineffability thing again.
This question is primarily for Bob, Jesse, and Andy Lecter. You were talking about Terence McKenna and sort of the interpretation through the lens of UFO belief system, and you were talking about very briefly spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber and how I don't know if you're familiar with the Wilbur-Combs lattice, but basically you have a peak experience and you interpret it based on where you are. And you mentioned the religious figure who felt that that religion was an inevitable result of this. And so I haven't had that many experiences, but when I've had sort of these peak experiences, I have obviously interpreted them while they were happening and a few days following, but then I decided not to let those interpretations remain. In other words, not let it get stuck in a context, not let it get stuck in an interpretation. Just have that something happen, I had an interpretation, what's next? Just being present. So I'm just curious if you have anything more you want to say about spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber and whether anything you were saying about, because I think you mentioned paganism, and maybe that's a contextualization. Is there a way, maybe you disagree, but is there a way to non-contextualize these experiences?
I caught most of what you were saying, but not the very last part. Could you say it again slowly, please?
Sorry. I was saying, is there a way to not contextualize? So in other words, through paganism, there's a contextualization. Through UFOlogy or whatever layer you are in spiral dynamics, you're saying, I had this peak experience, here's what it means, and then I'm questioning whether religion is inevitable, whether you can just have an experience, surely you're likely to have an interpretation during the experience, but then can you let that go? Like I've been trying to let it go and saying, I had an interpretation, done. What's next? What's happening right now? As opposed to trying to understand or contextualize these experiences in religion or any other context, science, for example.
It sounded like that's a personal question, so I'll answer personally. I don't know how to generalize beyond that. And it actually relates to the previous question. What's my philosophical orientation towards the world or spirit? I have experiences. As Brother David predicted, my brain cannot help but react to them, for them, against them, almost like an organism that's moving towards food or away from toxins. I cannot help often but to have language and interpretation show up, When there's emotional motivation behind it, I can't help but talk about it with friends. So some of that seems inevitable, and I don't really care to try to suppress it. I will say that for me, it feels like an advance that maybe like you, after a while I stop. And one of the reasons why I didn't answer the question about philosophical interpretation is that I feel as though in my own developmental course, some of what's happened so far is that a lot of my inappropriate certainty has been chipped away. And what's left is kind of, I don't know, try to keep my eyes open, listen to what my friends say, what my elders say. So I'm with you in allowing some interpretation to happen, but at the moment it feels okay to me to not get caught up in solidifying.
To which I would add, I think we always interpret. You cannot but interpret what's happening to you and what has happened to you. But an iterative process is set up whereby everything you've read and everything you've been exposed to shapes the trip you have, but then the trip shapes culture, if you see what I mean. It shapes how you perceive it the next time. So it's an ongoing hermeneutic process of interpretation, reinterpretation.
I would hope that in that ongoing hermeneutic process, wherein our personal experiences are then contributions to culture which come back and kind of close the loop on that which we cannot escape, my hope is that life gets to be more fun in that process.
This might be a good time to bring our conference to a close. Please clap again and help me thank these wonderful, wonderful speakers. Hear, hear, hear. So I want to specifically thank these folks by name. I want to thank Bill Richards, Franz Wollenweider, Alicia Danforth, Steve Ross, who's not here today but spoke yesterday, Valerie Mujenko, who's left as well, Earth and Fire Arrowwood, Andy Letcher, Bob Jesse, Bob Wald, all. Thank you so much for coming. I also want to thank Kevin once again for making it all happen, Kevin Balkdick.
And I think we should thank Neil.
Thank you. Thank you for putting me in this position to contribute in this way. I also want to thank Judson Memorial Church. It's not insignificant that we're here in this spectacular setting and with their largesse and their deference to what we're trying to do. I want to thank the artists from Friday night. The wonderful vibe that was created by by them. And also the volunteers. You've seen them working tirelessly. God, the food and the lighting, and it's mostly volunteer work, and it's not to be minimized, because again, we couldn't do this without that. And I want to thank you all, for coming here, with your intentionality and your sincerity, and then I hope you bring that out into the real world. So the real world. We've got a MAPS conference coming up in April in San Francisco. We've got the DPA conference in Albuquerque in November. We've got Manifesting the Mind world premiere screening just around the corner on October 4th. The Women's Visionary Conference, Congress this week coming up, visionarycongress.org. And we've got Horizons next year. So we're going to see you next year. Anybody wants to get involved, volunteering or curating or helping us in any way, please do so. You're very much encouraged to do so. So go forth and be brilliant, and we'll see you next year. Thank you very much.